Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Vice President Chen to give the opening remarks.
Professor Sheckman, Academician Wang, and dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is really my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Randy Sheckman. Randy is a professor of the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology in UC Berkeley, and more importantly, I thought, he is also an editor-in-chief of eLife journal. And Professor Sheckman have carried out a series of very important study on this transport vehicle, and he's going to give this very in-depth academic talk tomorrow. But today, he's going to give a talk on the publishing the most important work in the life sciences. And as we all know that Professor Sheckman has carried out very, very important research, and he also get many awards, and he got this an Upper Alaska Award for the basic medical research in year 2002. And as we all know that, everybody knows that there's an Alaska Award is a kind of candidacy for the Nobel Prize, right? So we are very glad to have Professor Sheckman to come to Academia Sinica, and this is his first time in Taiwan. So I think that we are very glad to have him here and to give us his talk. And I believe his talk will benefit all of us a lot. And let us welcome Professor Sheckman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first visit to Taiwan. Particularly excited that I was given an opportunity to talk about two of my favorite topics. One is scientific publishing, and the other is my research, which you'll hear about tomorrow if you come. Today, I want to talk about broad issues in publishing, and I know many of you are very concerned about this, and there are some important issues that have emerged in recent years that I want to review. First, very broadly, about what the landscape is, and secondly, some of the new initiatives, open access, electronic journals, and finally some of the more serious problems, particularly in publishing one's most important work at the high end in a very limited number of journals that we all seek to publicize our work, and some of the problems inherent in publishing at that level. And finally, I'll talk about a new initiative started a few years ago by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Wellcome Trust, and the Max Planck Society, which we hope will break the barriers at the high end for the most important work. And so I hope by the end of the hour to persuade you that there is another opportunity, more open-ended, for publicity for your most important work. So let's actually first talk about some of the issues that we face in the broad scientific literature, and for today I'm going to focus exclusively on the life sciences. That's because it's an area that I know best, but many of the same issues that I'll discuss bear on publications in the physical sciences, and I had direct experience with that because for 5 years I was the editor-in-chief of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which covers all of the sciences. So many of the themes that I'll focus on for the life sciences really do apply broadly. So let's discuss, first of all, the kinds of models of journals that we're all familiar with and which we have to consider when we're publishing our work. So first of all, there are different categories of journals. There are subscription-based journals. They are privately held, as you'll see, or publicly held, published sometimes by scientific societies, or by commercial publishers. There is now also a very important venue started by a journal called Biomed Central in Britain, but taken up most popularly by a series of journals published by the PLOS, the Public Library of Science, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and that is open access. Open access is a very important new principle that allows one to view the literature wherever you are without having to have a subscription or a license fee at your institution. It opens up the literature more broadly to everyone, including the public, who may wish to read the fruits of their investment, the public investment in science. So we'll talk about open access, and there are also models that include some hybrid, where some portion of the literature in a journal is published in open access, and others are held behind a firewall. For instance, at the proceedings of the National Academy, if you publish a paper in the PNAS, you can pay an additional fee to have your paper viewed by everyone all over the world without having a license to access that. And the fee is intended to cover the additional expense that the journal may incur by losing a certain fraction of the license fees that libraries are willing to pay. But if you don't care about that at the PNAS, if you wait 6 months, you can then read the literature. But some people really want access immediately, and I was surprised that 30% of people who publish their papers in the PNAS are willing to pay this open access fee, which is about $900, just to have their paper immediately available for public view. So that's a kind of a hybrid system. There are also, issues that are really crucial about whether the journal is printed in a typical hardbound journal, where many of us more senior people grew up with these hardbound issues, and it's very hard to give that up. But I would guess that most of you looking out in the audience don't even look at a hard copy of any journal. You access things online. You rely on services to focus in on those articles that you want to read. Nonetheless, as you'll see, some journals really insist on having a hard copy of the journal. Of course, all journals, or essentially all journals, provide online access to their content. Some journals, including the PLOS journals and the journal that I'll discuss, have access only online. There are no print versions. And I think that really is the future of publication. I think it's inevitable that as the years go on and people like me die off, there'll be no need to have a print version anymore. It'll all be electronically accessible. So there are still tensions that keep these print versions going. At the proceedings of the National Academy, I tried, when I was editor, to move in the direction of online exclusively, but the members of the National Academy who run the journal, being usually of the older generation, were very reluctant to give up on the hard copy of the journal, but they will eventually depart the scene, and that journal will change dramatically. There are also tensions between scientific societies that publish journals and commercial publishers. The major commercial publishers are Elsevier, Springer, Nature Publishing Group. These are private enterprise. They have stockholders who invest in these journals, and so they, of course, expect to turn a profit. And that introduces a kind of a conflict, because commercial publishers like Elsevier rely on not only subscriptions to their journals, but they rely on free labor that scientists, that scholars provide to review their papers, and page charges for the papers that are published. So a firm like Elsevier has a tremendous profit. They generate $1 billion in clear profit every year, but they do so relying on the generosity and the collegiality of scholars who contribute their labor to that effort. So that introduces a kind of a tension that I want to raise to your attention and discuss. Of course, then there are other profit-generating but public operations, and then a very large number of not-for-profit organizations, the PNAS being one of them. The mandate by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences for PNAS is to break even, to not make a profit and not make a loss, just to cover the expenses. And so page charges are not terribly steep as a result of that. There's another strain that I'd like to discuss that runs in the literature and that many of us feel strongly about, and that is the distinction between the use of professional editors and academic editors to make final decisions on papers. So you're all familiar with the basic process where you submit a paper to a journal. The journal then has a series of editors. They may be employed by the journal, or they may be in university positions, and those people then have to decide whether your article is appropriate for that journal. They then solicit opinions from experts, typically other academics. The experts then render their views, their return to the editor, and then it's really up to the editor to decide. So the question is, do you want to have those decisions made by a peer of yours, someone who is an academic who understands research, or would you rather have that made by someone who is more, let's say, broadly interested in lots of areas, but who does not or no longer has an active research program? And that is really a fundamental decision that you have to make when you decide where you're going to submit a paper. So these are all really interesting issues, differences between these formats that that generate a kind of a tension, and that has been changed really very dramatically by the advent of open access and online publication. So let's consider, first of all, the open access movement. As I said, this started about 15 years ago with a journal called Biomed Central in Britain, which conceived of the idea that scientists, scholars, would be willing to pay to have their papers published, and specifically they would be interested in having their work presented to others without the firewall of a subscription protecting the content of the journal article. So, for instance, in the U.S., and I'm sure true here in Taiwan, there's a public investment in medical research, and yet you, as a member of the Academia Sinica, will have access to these papers because you have a license here to and a subscription, but people in the community who may actually be very knowledgeable would not have access to your publication unless they were willing to pay a fee or have a license to pay for the journal. That would be very prohibitively expensive. A license for a journal can sometimes be thousands of dollars a year. And even for an individual medical article, sometimes a journal like Nature or the New England Journal of Medicine will charge an individual $30 just to download a single PDF of a research article. So someone, an intelligent layperson, may read something about some interesting medical advance in a newspaper and want to know more about it. Well, they can't have access to that unless the publication is in an open access journal, at which point they can have access. That's really a crucial distinction. So, open access has been promoted all over the world, particularly in Europe and in the U.S. The federal government in the U.S. has now made a policy through the NIH of insisting that any NIH-sponsored research must be available. They allow, if it's a very liberal policy, the journal must make its content available, but only after a year. Many of us feel that that's too liberal, that there ought to be a greater demand that publicly funded research should be available immediately to the public who's invested billions of dollars in medical research. So in Europe, both on the European continent and in Britain, there is a very strong move to assist in open access programs, that is to provide funds for publications in an open access venues. In the U.S., there was opposition from commercial publishers to open access, but this was defeated in Congress, fortunately, and legislation opposing open access was withdrawn. And this was in part because of a petition that the proponents of open access circulated that generated over 30,000 signatures, a very strong push within the community to insist that open access be allowed to go forward. And as a result, a new policy was introduced last year to support open access. So there is a movement, a very strong movement, and now we see more and more journals in this style of open access. Indeed, there's been a substantial growth. I said Biomed Central, PLOS, and an Egyptian outfit called Hindawi were the first to introduce open access journals. There's clearly a growth over the last decade. Unfortunately, the growth really accounts for still less than 10% of all the literature. So it's still not as important as it needs to be, but even the commercial journals now recognize that they have to go in this direction. They have to create open access venues because there is a demand for this availability. Now, very specifically, the funding agencies that I'm most familiar with, Howard Hughes, the Wellcome Trust, and the Max Planck Society, have encouraged their own investigators to publish in open access journals. In fact, if you're an investigator of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, every 5 years you have to go to Washington to be interviewed, to have your support renewed. And in that renewal, you're asked to provide the 5 most important papers that you've published in the preceding period of time. And each of those articles must be in an open access journal. If they're not in open access journals, or if they're not available for everyone to read online, they cannot be used to support a renewal. So there's a very strong push to do this. Likewise, Wellcome Trust provides an additional substantial sum of money, £1 billion a year, to make sure that their investigators can pay the additional fee necessary to make their publications available in open access journals. And likewise, the Max Planck Society is encouraging Max Planck directors to use open access. So all the journals really have to conform to this because of this very strong push to make the research available publicly. Now, unfortunately, even so, the 3 journals that we'll talk about in some detail that are most popular, Nature, Cell, and Science, account for a very large fraction of the important work of the investigators of these 3 organizations, and the other journals are only just slowly catching up, the PLOS journals. So that's why the leaders of these organizations have not only decided that they need to push this, but they decided, as you'll see later on, to create a new journal that would provide an attractive venue for publishing the most important work. Okay, now I'd like to turn to another topic that you've all, I think, experienced, and that is the rigors of peer review. I mean, we all embrace the peer review system, even though it can take a lot of time and trouble and money to get through it. And the problem is how to reform the system to make it more flexible, to allow it to address our needs without destroying young careers. There are those journals that are most attractive that we'll discuss, Cell, Nature, and Science, and Life Sciences, and for reasons that I'll mention, it's very difficult to publish in those journals. And so they impose, as a result of their method of publishing, very stringent standards. Sometimes we consider them capricious standards, really hard to understand, standards that block the publication of most papers. For instance, Science magazine publishes only 6% of the papers that are submitted. Nature magazine publishes only 8% of the papers that are submitted. And so you have to run through a gauntlet of opposition in order to get your work published in these venues. And many of us feel that this is an artificial restriction of a commodity that is imposed by the demand that these journals publish on a piece of paper, on a print version. Science magazine, for instance, publishes 50 pages of science a week, covering all of the sciences. Imagine the entire world of scientific literature struggling to get that attention and space in those 50 pages. So many of us feel that the system is broken as a result of this slavish adherence to the print model. So the peer review system, we feel, at that high end is broken, and I want to address how one might be able to change the peer review system through procedures that are more open and consultative that we've developed at the journal eLife. Well, in fact, many investigators have complained about this, complained so much that they've even had editorials written in Nature and Science magazine. Here is an immunologist at MIT by the name of Hidde Pluch, who wrote in Nature, peer review of scientific papers in top journals is bogged down by unnecessary demands for extra lab work, argues Hidde Pluch. And Martin Raff, Sandy Johnson, Peter Walter, publishing in Science magazine, the stress associated with publishing experimental results can drain much of the joy from practicing science. So even scientists like Pluch and Walter and Johnson and Raff, who actually are very successful in publishing their work, recognize that this is a strain on the system and has caused a lot of broken careers. Very often you submit a paper that you feel is your very best work to a journal like that, and it can go through multiple rounds of review over and over again with increasing demands and additional expense, and even after a year or more, the paper can ultimately be rejected. So that's really, we think, a waste of resources that needs to be addressed. And this, as some of you may recognize, often is the result of what is considered to be that evil referee number 3, in this case, Adolf Hitler. This is sometimes seen as the evil third referee that's blocking the publication of your most important work. And my view is that much of the problem is reduced to the reliance on print. And in the 21st century, I would argue that there is no longer a need to impose the artificial restriction of print on publishing important science. Now, I'd like to turn to another problem that is exemplified here, I have to say, by your colleagues in mainland China, and that is the pressure is made even worse on young scholars to publish their most important work in a very small number of journals. And you may not be able to read the print here, and of course I couldn't translate this for you, but I'll tell you what this is. This is a document that is circulated this year by the Institute of Biophysics of the Chinese Academy of Science, which offers scholars in mainland what amounts, I think, to a bribe to publish in Cell Nature and Science to the tune of 200,000 yuan, or which was translated for me to equate to 33,000 US dollars. This is a personal reward, not for one's science. That introduces many problems. Of course, then I was even more offended when I saw that a paper in the PNAS was only worth 50,000 yuan. And finally, journals that are local journals in China are worth apparently only 500 yuan. So 200,000 versus 500 yuan. Bribes. This really amounts to a bribe. Now, I think this is really shocking at many levels. It's shocking that someone, by the mere fact of having published a paper in such a journal, would be given this kind of a reward. I think it introduces all kinds of strains in the system. It makes people, I fear that it may make some people who are vulnerable to this cut corners to make their work seem more attractive, more appealing, somehow more important. And that's maybe not coincidental that papers that are in journals that are at this very high end are more likely to be retracted than papers in journals that are less popular. So this is, I think, a terrible policy, and I want to take them to task by publicizing this wherever I am. Now, part of the problem is not just the journals, the name of the journal. It's something I think even more sinister, and that is something called the impact factor. And I think this now is a problem that is international, and I want to not only express my personal views, but I'd like to draw you out in a discussion about this. What is impact factor? I think every postdoc in the room knows what impact factor is, you probably can recite the impact factor of Nature to 3 significant figures. That's because they advertise this. You receive online advertising from Nature in big, bold letters, 30 point blah, blah, blah. This is the number of citations for all the papers in the journal divided by the number of papers in the journal. It's a simple number. It was invented many years ago for the exclusive use of librarians who had to decide which journals to subscribe to for their universities. It was never intended to be a measure of the importance of one's work. It was only a simple gimmick to allow librarians to decide which journals to subscribe to. And yet, over the years, it has turned into a monster, I think. It's really an inadequate measure for many reasons of the true importance of work. And let's think about this. Now, what generates a very high impact factor for a journal? A journal like Nature will very often decide to accept a paper for the journal because of the knowledge of the editors that the paper will generate a lot of citations. And so they will have some papers in the journal that generate thousands of citations. They'll have other articles that generate many fewer citations. And yet the article that generates very few citations is still, because it's published in Nature, somehow considered of equal importance. There are also enormous differences among scientific fields. In the physical sciences, papers generate many fewer citations than in the medical sciences. Something that has clinical application will generate enormous numbers of citations. So is it really fair to be judged by that kind of a standard, that you happen to publish in a journal that happens to attract papers that have very high citations? So many of us feel that that the system is broken at this level too, that this slavish reliance on impact factor has distorted the importance of basic science for commercial purposes. And so, as a result, last year in San Francisco, a group of scientific editors, and I was one of them, met to discuss how we might try to influence people against the use of impact factor in calculating or in doing research assessment for young scholars. And so we created something called DORA, which is the Declaration on Research Assessment, which for those of you who have a handout there, you can go online and see what the DORA statement says, but I'll summarize it. The general recommendations are that at all levels, scholars, administrators, universities, publishers should not rely on this number because it's a phony number that really doesn't adequately measure the true value of scholarly output. There should be other measures, different metrics that can be used, and in the final analysis, if one's weighing the importance of a young scholar's work, it's actually necessary to read the papers and not simply to rely on where the paper is published. That is not the measure that we as scholars should rely on. There are many new tools that allow one to evaluate citations for individual papers and not to rely on some aggregate that can be gamed by the journal. So we're urging that at all levels that additional measures be used and that this one number be diminished in importance. We now have over 9,000 signatures on this document online that you can find at this website. So please look it up. Now I have to tell you, we've evaluated the geographic distribution of people who have signed on to this statement from all over the world. The majority of signatures come from Europe and North America, and unfortunately only 1% of the signatures come from scholars in Asia. So I'm really hopeful that you'll go and look at this site, and if you feel strongly about it, please add your name, and more importantly, look at exactly the recommendations and use those in evaluating where you want to publish your work. All right, now, in the end of this part of my presentation, I'd like to focus on this new initiative started by Howard Hughes, the Wellcome Trust, and Max Planck It began 2 years ago with a meeting at the Howard Hughes headquarters where we gathered a number of key principals who are in the open access movement and funding agencies. And the three presidents of the funding these organizations came to the room with the imperative that the system was broken, that they wanted to make a personal investment of their own resources, the funds from these organizations, to create a journal that would cater to the most important work in the life sciences, but which would break the stranglehold that the commercial publishers have on this process. There are plenty of journals. We don't need another journal. There are thousands of journals. But at the very high end, the journals that you all wanted to publish in, there's a logjam. It's difficult, very difficult, and many of you have experienced very difficult, and that needn't be, and it's because of this silly reliance on an artificial commodity. So they wanted not only to do that, but they wanted to return control of the literature to active scientists and away from professional editors. And so having served as the editor of PNAS for 5 years, I was eager to take on this new challenge because these organizations were willing to invest substantial resources to make sure that this was a successful venture. So it is our journal, eLife, is supported financially by these three of the world's largest and most powerful funding agencies. And their mandate was to create an effective research tool for communication of the most important work in the life sciences. But equally, they felt strongly that the journal should be entirely editorially independent of the funding organizations. That is, they provide funds for us to do our work, but every decision is in the control of the editorial board, all active scientists, most of whom are not funded by these organizations. So we are entirely independent, although we encourage investigators of these organizations to publish in eLife. They have no special privileges, and they have no mandate to publish. It's all free choice. All right, so what is eLife? Not only is it a collaboration between the funders and the research community, really a quite novel concept in publishing, but it is entirely led by active researchers. You'll see that our editorial board is all very prominent scientists from around the world, and we, although we have professional staff who manage the journal, they do not make editorial decisions. Those are all made by scientists. Our initiative is also a mandate is to create a venue with a unique digital medium, and we can talk about what we've done in that respect. And we want to maximize the reach and influence of new research, and not to rely simply on what's popular or what the latest fad is. We want to actually weigh, using our scientific judgment, the intrinsic merit of the work, irrespective of application or fad. Now, my first task when I started 2 years ago was to appoint a group of senior editors. These are busy people, but who are asked to commit up to 7 hours a week in judging research papers that are submitted. And I was really greatly pleased to be able to secure the services first of two deputy editors, Fiona Watt, who is a Wellcome Trust investigator in London, and Detlev Weigel, a plant scientist who is a Max Planck investigator in Tübingen. We then set about to identify around the world the best active scholars in all of the disciplines that we wish to cover, and we have many from all over the world. I'm particularly pleased that we could attract people like Joe Goldstein in Texas, and Prabhat Jha in Toronto, Vijay Raghavan in India, Jiadong Wang in Beijing. So we have scholars representing all of the many disciplines that we wish to cover. Now, when a paper is submitted to eLife, it's immediately handed over to one of these individuals who decides if the work is of intrinsic merit. Is there some new, substantial, important addition to the literature represented by this work? So that's, of course, a personal judgment, but it's made not by a professional editor, it's made by an active scientist, and so we rely on these people for their judgment. As you'll see, as I discuss the editorial process, that paper, if it's judged to be potentially important, is then turned over to a group of about, and now we have about 175 members of the Board of Reviewing Editors. These are also many very active scholars from around the world who commit through their time not only to serve as an editor, but in each case to serve as a referee, to read the paper and to make a scientific judgment about that paper, and then to appoint 2 other individuals who also serve as ad hoc referees. Now, we have some experience because we started publishing last November, and I can tell you that we do have a fairly broad representation. On the left is a pie chart of the distribution of areas that we cover that are in the initial submissions that are sent to us. So, for instance, biochemistry represents a significant fraction, structural biology likewise, cell biology, neuroscience, but also human biology, immunology, microbiology, developmental biology. And then after the review process, we publish equally in many of these areas. We have a very strong representation in neuroscience and cell biology and in microbiology, and we really have no restrictions as long as something is relevant to the life sciences. Because of the very generous support from these funding agencies, not only is the journal open access, so anybody can read it anywhere in the world, but we have no fees associated with publishing, no page charges, no color charges, obviously. For the next 3 years, it'll be completely free to publish in eLife. And then thereafter, we will start charging page charges, but we are unlikely to charge enough to even cover our expenses because the funding agencies are so committed to this that they've assured us that they will continue to subsidize this journal as long as it continues to be successful. So this is obviously very generous support. Not every journal that starts can do this, but that's how committed these organizations are to the success of this journal. Now, I'd like to spend a few minutes describing what I consider to be really the most unique aspect of the journal, which will really distinguish it, I think you'll agree, from any other journal that you may have experienced, and that is our review process. So as I've already indicated, the paper that comes in will come in with just a single PDF and a cover letter. The PDF can be in any format, at least initially. That then is reviewed by a senior editor. The senior editor decides if the paper really looks interesting, potentially acceptable. If so, it is then, the author is then informed to supply additional information, to put the paper in a proper format. That can happen within 3 days. Typically, the decision is made fairly quickly. And then at that point, when a full submission is returned, it is sent to one of the members of the Board of Reviewing Editors, this very large group. That person then chooses 2 other individuals to serve as ad hoc referees. This is more or less as you would experience with any other journal. But then what happens is really fairly unique. At that point, after usually 3 or 4 weeks, the opinions of the 3 referees are collected at a manuscript website online, and the identity of the referees is revealed to each other. So when you submit a review for an article, you know going into the process that your identity will be shared with the other referees. And you then engage over the course of a day or more in an online consultation, a back and forth, where you read the other critiques and you then comment to the other referees what you view as the strengths or weaknesses of the arguments pro and con. This, I think you'll agree, is very different than any other journal. Typically, in another journal, the reviews are considered by an editor, a professional editor, a scientific editor, and that person then has to make the decision on his or her own view of the reviews. But in this case, the referees have to argue their case, and I think this introduces an interesting feature, particularly since the referees are known to each other. You going into the process, you have to be respectful of someone else's opinion, and you can't then just say something outrageous and hide behind your anonymity. You know the other people because it's, of course, a small research area, so you have to argue your case, and this generates some very interesting conversations, online conversations among the referees. I'll show you a couple of examples in a moment. So the referees then confer with one another. The board member, who's also a referee, after this process of consultation, assembles a set of instructions. Either the paper is going to be favorably considered, or the paper is going to be rejected at this point. If the opinions of the referees are strongly negative, the paper will be rejected. The board member will write a paragraph describing the reasons, and then you as an author will receive all the critiques of the three referees. If, on the other hand, the paper is going to be is favorably reviewed, then the editor writes a single letter with only the most important issues that you have to address. And we instruct the board member and the referees to limit their comments to those things that are considered absolutely directly related to the major conclusions of the paper, and not to exercise their imagination and thinking of all the clever new experiments that they'd like you to do. It's restricted because we don't want papers to languish for more than a couple of months in an author's hands. We want to be able to give the author only the most restricted comment. So you get, as an author, a single letter that has only the list of only the things that you need to address. And if you are able to do that, the revised paper goes back to the board member, and since that board member was also a referee and supervised the review process, they are asked to make a decision on the spot without conferring with the referees again. So that as a result, most of the papers that are accepted in eLife do not take more than a couple of months for the final decision to be rendered. In fact, we now have an average of about 77 days from the initial submission to acceptance for those papers that are going to be published, and most of that time is the time that the author may take to address the concerns of the referee. It's not taken up in the back and forth, constant back and forth that I know many of you have experienced. So you get a single set of instructions if you're encouraged to resubmit, you do so. It goes back to the board member, and that then the decision is made. And our experience is that when you are encouraged to return a revised version, that paper is 95% of the time accepted without any further changes. Very high success rate once you get to that point, which is not true at other journals. Now, when the paper is published, a couple months later, the letter that you were sent with the asking for revisions, as well as your rebuttal, is posted after the manuscript on the online HTML version of your paper. That is posted only if you are willing to have it posted, which is true for almost all of our authors. So that provides an interesting little insight into the review process. So if you go to the journal and you click on any of the articles, if you look at the HTML version, you'll go to the end, you'll be able to read what the referees thought and how the author responded. So the end result, we believe, is an open, very constructive, consultative process. We think that this style of collegiality could be adopted by any journal, and we're hoping to change the culture by introducing this idea. Here are a couple of examples where I've made the referee's identity anonymous, but when as a referee, your comments are identified, this person's name is removed, but when you serve as a referee, you see the individual names of all the people who are participating and their comments back and forth to each other. This was a relatively straightforward one that was accepted and published. Here was a somewhat lengthier commentary back and forth, and we have some that go on for pages and pages. Really, actually quite interesting for me as the editor to go in and read all these conversations as they develop. I feel like a voyeur and reading what's going on. And they're really, I think the referees who experience this actually quite enjoy the process, because they finally, as a referee, you finally feel that you have some constructive role. Instead, with other journals, you're often writing a report and it goes into some electronic void, and you never have any further interaction with the editor. So we think that the referees enjoy this process. So, in the final analysis for eLife, we have a swift process of triage by a senior editor. If the paper is not going to be considered, you hear usually within a few days. The board member, we insist, serve as a referee, as well as identifying other people. There is a single review decision for papers that are favorably reviewed, and the authors are given very specific comments that are only the essential things that are crucial to a conclusion. And then in the final analysis, the board member handles the decision and usually within a day can render a final decision. Well, we've had some experience now over the last 8 or 9 months. At the initial stage, I can tell you about 40% of the papers are then submitted for full review. After that, about half of the papers are eventually published. So it's, I think, a reasonable level. We're still appealing to a high end. We're still selective, but we're not, I don't think, we don't have ridiculous standards. Now, of course, we can't satisfy everyone. We have rejected some papers, and I'll show you in the last slide that I've taken some abuse from some of the people whose papers we've rejected. One in particular was James Watson, who submitted a review article to us, which was rejected. He was not at all happy with that. And so at a meeting of the American Association of Cancer Researchers, he made a public statement, including taking me to task personally, but apparently I wasn't alone. There were other editors that rejected this. I hate the editors of these journals more than I hate Republicans, by James Watson. Now, I'm at UC Berkeley, and you may know that Berkeley is a very liberal place, and to be compared unfavorably to a Republican is about as insulting as one can imagine. So that's it for the formal remarks that I have now, and I'd like to open it up for discussion. I'd really like to hear your opinions on the questions of open access, of publishing in hard copy journals or online, and I'm particularly eager to hear your opinions about the influence of impact factor in the decisions that you make about where to publish your most important work. Thank you for your attention. Okay, I can take this up.
Sheckman just give us a very interesting presentation about this and how to publish the paper in a very fair and constructive review journal. So I think it's very interesting to all of us. So is there any comment or questions for Professor Sheckman? Yes, Professor.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first question is, I wonder if you care to compare the recent PLOS journals with your eLife.
Sure.
And my second question is that it's not really a question about eLife, but it's just always curious to myself that I know in some field like mathematics, they really just arrange in alphabetical orders. And
The authors.
yes. Mm-hmm. And you realize we have lots of co-corresponding authors, multiple co-first authors, and the fist fighting, etc. So see, different fields have so different cultures. In politics, I'm under the impression that actually you don't know the identity of the authors. The reviewer's identity will have to be revealed, of course, as many journals are doing these days. However, during the review process, you can guess, but you can second guess because just judging by the style of writing or the citations, sometimes you could be wrong. But the fact is the identity of the authors are concealed. I could be wrong, but I'm under the impression that in politics, that's the way they practice. And in mathematics, it's a simple rules, alphabetical orders. And yet in biology, so this is not a specific question about eLife. It's really at your academic status. I'm just very curious.
Well, you've asked
your opinion.
Many questions, so let me.
No, only 2 questions.
Okay, I heard many, so let me start with the first, and that is, why would we do this eLife when PLOS already really pioneered open access? Well, PLOS is a fine set of journals. They've had enormous impact, but I think they made a fundamental mistake right from the start with their flagship journal, PLOS Biology, which was that in order, their interest was in competing, providing an alternative venue to Cell, Nature, and Science, and they felt in order to do this that they had to hire professional editors. So PLOS Biology is largely run by professional editors, and so many authors who've otherwise enjoy that journal complain bitterly about issues relating to the use of professional editors, the time that it takes, the multiple rounds of review, and the capricious decisions. So we wanted to break that mold. We wanted to have our strongest feeling was to use active scientists, and with the generosity of our funding agencies, we were able to pay our scientific editors for the time that they take to do the review process, and that is a very strong principle that we have, that we think people should be paid for their efforts, and so we ask a lot of our editors, and they're paid accordingly. So we think that we're different than PLOS, although of course we appreciate the pioneering role they had in popularizing open access, but we think we're different and we have a different model. Now, you've asked many things about the different cultures in scientific publishing, and I had to deal with these different cultures as editor of the PNAS. Mathematicians are very interesting in the way they handle papers. I found that most mathematicians were delighted when they had a decision on their paper within a year of submitting the paper. And the physical sciences in general have a very different culture. So for instance, the physics archive is now the major place where people want to post their work without any peer review at all. They just post their articles online on the physics archive, and there's a period of post-publication review. Comments are often written privately to the author, I'm told. And then scholars who've had their work posted on the physics archive will, for purposes of promotion in academic appointments, will often then withdraw the paper and then submit it after the fact to a commercial publisher like Science or Nature to actually have a formal review process. And as you've said, the cultures differ dramatically in the pressure about where one is placed in the list of authors. I don't know why the culture differs so much, but in the life sciences, there's a tremendous feeling that one's priority is crucially dependent on where you are in a list of authors. So having authors be alphabetically listed just would not work in the life sciences, just for cultural reasons. Now, you also raise an interesting question that's often posed to me. What would we have a fairer, more transparent process if the identity of the authors were blinded to the referees? This has come up repeatedly, and many of us have argued this point, and we always come to the conclusion that this just wouldn't work. Because, as you said yourself, for prominent people, you can tell, as you say, by the style of writing or by the list of references who the authors of the paper were. So, in a way, I think this might serve as an impediment for young people who hadn't established their identity. And I can tell you, in our own experience at eLife, since the concern is often raised that somehow Hughes investigators are getting a special treatment. In fact, we have made a deliberate policy at eLife to promote papers submissions from beginning investigators. We asked beginning investigators to identify in their cover letter if they are an early stage investigator. And as a result, a greater percentage of papers from early stage investigators are submitted for full review than for senior investigators. So we actually lean over backwards to try to encourage young investigators. There's just, in answer to your general second question, there's just a different culture, and although the physics archive seems to work for physical sciences, for the time being, I don't think it would work for the life sciences.
I'm wondering, I took a look at your board of reviewing board, and I could not find an expert in biological NMR. So,
biological NMR.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I wonder, even though you have almost 200 people there, how broad, how much can you do more to cover all that?
Well, I often get questions about specific areas, and we're just in the next few months going to be changing and inviting new people. We do have NMR papers, and Axel Brunger, though he's a crystallographer, also is well versed in NMR, and he has handled papers that were principally NMR papers, and he is then invited, since he knows the field, he's invited ad hoc referees who are even more well versed in the field. So in that case, I think we can actually cover papers, and we have published papers in that area. But there are other areas that are also not represented, and we'll be adding new board members as suggestions come in. So please don't be dissuaded by that, because we because of the generosity of our funding agencies, we can bring on more editors. Yes, go on.
Randy, I think this reviewing process is very innovative there in the review of journals. But of course, in the study section of grant applications, these are the way it has been done.
Sure.
Everyone read it, and then you write a review, and then you meet and talk about it. But is this sustainable for reviewers to do this all the time? It's very time consuming.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Okay, so we believe it is sustainable because the board members who take the burden in leading this discussion are paid for their effort. I mean, it's not a lot of money, but there's some compensation. The referees, of course, have to do a little more work as well. But I can tell you that the referees who joined in these discussions quite enjoy it. I mean, you've probably had the experience of submitting a review, posting it on the Cell website, and that's the last you hear of it. You can look at the other referee comments. They're anonymous, and then you have no further input. I think many of us would actually enjoy that give and take. It's like you're at a scientific meeting. You're arguing points with peers, known to each other. It's like at the NIH study section. So we have not had problems. Of course, it's still early days, and people who are unwilling to do this, of course, decline to do it. But we've had very few people decline.
All right, follow-up question. Are eLife actually being considered as the part of the impact factor calculations, or being forced into by the ISI?
Of course, we're asked all the time, what's
Right.
our impact factor, and I say, my usual answer is I don't care whether, But in fact, we will, next year, it'll come time when we have to decide whether we want to apply to the Web of Science. And our position now is that we don't want to apply. We don't want to play that game. And so we're hoping, and we feel that we have enough backing, that we can resist the temptation that even PLOS didn't resist. And our position now is that we don't want to play that game.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So our hope is that we're not victims of our arrogance, and that others will follow.
Any other question from the audience?
Well,
Yes.
I'd like to ask generally some of the students and postdocs in the audience, what are your thoughts about this when you make a decision about where you want to publish,
Hello, Professor Sheckman. I got a question, and it's because I heard of another company is doing some similar task. That's correct. Just try to have some editor member and reviewer members and have a cooperation.
Yeah.
And then the next step is kind of similar, but they try to do a review and finish our review and to decide which journal to submit. And
Yes.
if fail
Yes.
in Nature, so
Yes.
they change to plus biology,
Yes.
and if fail again, they
Yes.
change to plus
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what is your opinion about this new company consulting reviewers?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I heard about that. I don't know how successful they'll be, but it's an interesting idea. I think things are changing. People are upset with the system, and I think we need to do a lot of experiments. And if that is a successful model, then I wish them well. I still think, in the life sciences at least, that there are going to be journals that are going to be very selective, and the way that we wish to proceed is to have our high standards, but then we ask every referee if they would be willing to share their review and their identity with another journal, and so we're building up a consortium of journals, and so an author who is, let's say, unsuccessful at eLife could have the electronic file and the reviews sent to the other journal, and if the other journal is willing to accept the comments of the referees we select, then they could publish their paper with much less, with no delay. So that's a variation on the model that you've described by this other outfit. So we'd like to build up a big consortium of lots of journals in the life sciences who are willing to accept the judgment of our referees. And so that's our model, and we'll see if it succeeds.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any youngsters want to make comment?
Yes, in the back.
Andy is the academician one. He's not a youngster.
I'm the old guard. Impact factor has been a troublesome phenomenon over the years, and we all know about it. But if we don't use that, so I saw in your declaration that other tools or other measurements should
Yes.
be well designed. So I don't know what kind of other tools you have in mind.
All right.
First of all. Two, I think your journal will become successful, no doubt about it, because I have experience many years ago when I was at MIT. And a number of us discussed about this, and we came up with, not me, but the people in MIT came up with Cell. Cell eventually became very successful.
Yeah.
Now, part of the reason that all those journals are successful is because you have a group of people that behind it and then promote it, okay? And so that has two consequences. One is sometimes, like Nature or Science, they tend to have fashions.
Yes.
When things are become fashionable, everybody jump into it, and so, like, I remember several years ago, Science has published papers and after papers about buckyfuran, and I don't know why buckyfuran are so important, but nonetheless, every issue of Science will have a buckyfuran paper. That was many years ago. So I think your journal, because of the editorial boards or review members and so on, I'm sure it will be successful, no doubt about it. But in the end, then people will ask, what's your impact factor of eLife? Another complaint I heard about is, all these high-power people, and sure, you do your research, and then you have your opinion, what's important. And then other less developed countries or less developed teams, and they sometimes have very interesting projects or papers, and they got rejected because they are not in the mainstream, so to speak. So how would you see about this?
Yeah.
And is there a solution for it?
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your opinion. I will see you tomorrow anyway.
Okay. Well, again, you asked several interesting questions, so let me take them in turn. The first was how to measure impact. Since inevitably we want to assess the importance of one's work, it has to be measured in some way. I argue that this impact factor is a very flawed metric. It was not designed for what it's being used for, and I can't help if people ask, what's my impact factor? I get this question all the time. My intention is to try to avoid actually having that imposed on us. You actually have to apply to have an impact factor calculated. I want to resist that. How to measure impact, or how to measure quality? There are many different ways. One can measure the number of citations that an individual paper achieves. One can measure other forms of recognition that the paper achieves. But here's a simple way that I can tell you is, I think, very effective, and that is when one's measuring the quality of work of an investigator, let's say someone who's up for promotion, or you're considering a junior, applicants for a position, you might ask each applicant to write 100 words describing their most important discovery. And it seems to me that could work as a complete alternative way of evaluating one's impact. And I'll tell you why I think that works. I've had experience with this. When one is a candidate for election to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, you don't cite an impact factor in evaluating someone's achievements for that recognition. Instead, what you do is you write a nomination for someone that includes a 50-word statement of impact of the discoveries, and then another 250-word statement of impact, together with a list of about a dozen important papers. And I can tell you, since I've been in the room when these things are discussed and the final ballot is assembled, it is the content, the intellectual content, as described in as few as 50 words, that is key in allowing one to judge the importance of one's discoveries, and not some phony number. So I think actually we could go to a simple written statement and allow that kind of distinction to be made among scholars. And it works at that very high level, and I think it could work at other levels. So anyway, I'm hopeful that there'll be alternatives. I'm happy to hear other alternatives, but I really think impact factor is flawed and should not be used. I know I'll continue to get that question, but I'm hoping to resist that. Yes?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My question is about language, because one of the ideas to have open access journals is that science will be available for the public, but not necessarily the public speak English. So my question is there any idea or any approach that eLife is thinking to have any kind of collaborations with, to make at least highlights of the most important papers in other language for the public?
That's a great idea. No, we haven't really. We're just busy struggling to get the best papers first. But but that's a wonderful thought to have some. Since open access is part of our DNA, it doesn't mean anything if people can't read and understand the English language. So that's something that I think deserves some further consideration.
Well, I just want to say that those of us who are 60 years or older, we went through our career without impact factors, and we were fine. So don't think that you cannot do without impact factors. You can. So I think I fully support your decision. I hope you stick to it of not publishing your impact factors. And if you could convince more journals or societies to do the same, then we will be back to the good old days that we publish in the society journals that we belong. Okay.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So I trust that you will not use impact factor when you're making decisions.
No, I think in Taiwan actually we are I think we try to stay away from impact factors in our promotion of junior faculty. We don't ask them to list impact factors.
Professor Tai is the director of our Institute of Biological Chemistry.
Oh, great. Great. But how about I'd like to hear from the young people here, because you're the ones, when I try to convince a postdoc to publish in eLife, they're very worried because, I don't have an impact factor. And, so I know the pressure that you're under in making those decisions, so I'd like to hear you express those views. Any young people here want to say something? Yes?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor. Well, I think that publishing in open access journal is the future, as you said. But I think that maybe for at least for the publication for the graduation project, maybe we will not publish in eLife, because I think we are required to publish we need to fulfill some requirements, I think. I don't know if some other students agree with me, but I think that this definitely is the future of publishing in open access journals.
I think I missed your point. What you feel that as a student that you're required to publish somewhere else? I don't understand.
What I mean is that students doing their PhD works, they're to fulfill the requirements for graduation. I think we need some impact factor. I mean,
I see. So we have a
you need to
difference.
fulfill.
We have a difference of opinion here about whether this is important. Yeah.
So this is just. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that I want to. I want to fight against that attitude, and so it has to be expressed openly. I think this is it's a crutch, really. Other institutions, perhaps not the Academia Sinica, but other institutions feel that they don't have the intellectual infrastructure to evaluate the quality of work without relying on this phony number. And so what we want to do is to provide other ways of evaluating the importance of a piece of work. So for an eLife paper, we write, for each paper, we write a one-sentence statement that tries to distill the discovery and to allow a reader to instantly grasp the importance of that discovery. We also, for each paper, we have a professional science writer who writes a 300-word description in broad scientific language of the importance of that work, so that anyone who's scientifically literate at all can understand and grasp what the importance of that piece of work is, and that's done for every paper. We also, for first authors of eLife papers, we as the members of the editorial board have agreed to write letters of recommendation for an author for a job or a fellowship. Yeah, so you can have a letter written that I sign or that I write or Joe Goldstein writes. So go to Nature and see if they'll do that for you.
That's a good idea.
Randy, actually, this is an important one because you've been really promoting this as an idea of a whole community.
Yeah.
That this is, what you just said is the beginning of a different style of community building, right?
Yeah. But we're trying to change the culture. I mean, we're not simply trying to promote eLife, which I'm obviously doing. But I think some of the things that I've mentioned, like our review process, could be adopted by other journals. I think this kind of openness.
Yes.
And I think in particular would apply to journals where active scientists are making the final decision. I think less so for journals that are run by professional editors.
Good. Professor Su.
Again, this is not directly related to your eLife journal, but I'm just curious about your opinion. Have you ever heard about H-index?
Yeah.
And do you care to comment about that?
Well, it's another
It's a
number.
new culture forming.
Yeah. It's another number. The H-index is now a number that applies to an individual. Usually, it's some kind of reflection of one's own personal impact factor, judged over a career. So, somebody's told me what my H number is pretty good. I mean, but I would never put it on my CV because I don't care about things like that. But it's a number that's meaningless for a young scholar because they haven't had enough of a track record to generate any kind of a number. So, I mean, the crucial thing is what you do here or at other institutions do when you're promoting a beginning faculty member or when you're reviewing applications for a job. And that's where I think these numbers are meaningless, and that where one has to actually do the hard work of evaluating the scholarly impact of the work, which means you read the papers or you get some distilled statement that allows anyone who knows the general area to say, yes, this is an important discovery, or this person's made some important contributions, irrespective of where they publish their papers.
Okay. Any other comment? Yes.
One interesting question that I experienced early on is I think everyone evaluates their own work is really wonderful or excellent, and so therefore they want to publish their work. But often if we submit our manuscript to Science Nature, this kind of journal, we receive a comment say, your work may be interesting, but it's not worth to publish in Science and Nature. So I wonder, for a young faculty or junior students, how do we choose the best fit journal to be published? Yeah. And that principle may be very advisable for us.
Well, I mean, I I can't tell you not to try Science and Nature. I mean, I've published papers in Science, Nature, and Cell. I used to. I refuse to do it anymore. But just know that when you make the decision to send to those journals, you're competing for the print pages that they hold as a precious, some kind of resource, which is artificial in the 21st century. So you're buying into their model by doing so, and I think I don't think it's worth the anguish really of having to deal with journals like that, because they impose these restrictions, or they look for papers that are, I've had this described to me by a Cell editor. They look for papers that they think will generate a lot of citations. So it becomes a vicious cycle that you're buying into when you submit a paper to that journal. So you should find a journal that values the intrinsic merit of the work, and irrespective of the number of citations that it's going to generate. And so and I think if we all, if more of us do that, then these journals will have to loosen their grip on young scholars.
First question is there a general advice or principle for junior scientists to choose the best fit journal to publish their work?
Yeah. So, I mean, your objective when you publish a paper is for the people who are really interested in your work to see your paper, and that can be true if you publish in the JBC. The JBC is a fine journal. But if your work maybe cuts across different disciplines and is not just strictly in a particular field, then maybe you want to publish in a journal that is broadly based. And I would say, for instance, the PNAS is a great journal for that reason. It covers all of sciences. The decisions are all made by active scientists, and it's not this artificial restriction. My policy at the PNAS was, if we have great papers, we'll publish more papers. We're not limited by in some artificial number of pages. That is our principle at eLife as well.
Yes.
I think open access is great, but the problem is it's expensive, and I predict that prose biology will be going down all the time because it's so expensive. And in fact it's going down.
Well, actually, okay, let me comment on that. And I was meaning to say something. What PLOS did that was actually quite brilliant as a marketing tactic was to generate a new journal called PLOS One, which is basically a journal of last resort. They publish 70% of the papers that are accepted. And their model is, if you want your work published, we don't care if it's some great new discovery of some special impact. We just want it to be accurate as best we can judge it. They charge you something like $1,400, which more than covers their expenses because they don't invest very much in the publication of the work. There's very little copy editing of the paper. It's processed mechanically. So in fact, I don't agree with you. It's not expensive to publish in open access. $1,400 is not a lot of money to charge for an article, and so as a result, PLOS One will publish 15,000 papers this year. It is now the largest journal in the world. It's a very successful model, and it's not only successful in its own right, but the extra revenue that they generate supports all the other PLOS journals. So PLOS Biology will not fail because PLOS One is such a remarkable success. Now, the downside of this, I feel, is that PLOS Biology used to be the flagship of the PLOS journals, but I think PLOS One is now the flagship journal. Whenever you think about PLOS nowadays, you think about PLOS One because they publish so many papers. So I think in a way it's kind of eroded the quality of that brand name. So we don't want to do that at eLife. We want to maintain high standards. So I think open access is a sustainable model.
Okay. Any other comment? Questions? Yeah. If not, I think the time is up. And let us thanks Professor Sheckman again.